Some claims spread because they're shocking. Others spread because they seem to answer questions people have been asking for centuries. This one manages to do both. Across social media, thousands of people repeat a remarkable idea. That the Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text older than most of the New Testament, teaches that salvation isn't about faith at all. Instead, they say it depends on one entirely different condition. If that's true, it wouldn't just change how people read one forgotten book. It would change how we understand the religious world that existed before Christianity itself. The problem is that almost nobody making this claim ever shows you where the Book of Enoch actually says it. No chapter. No passage. No manuscript. Just the conclusion. Displays. Before we decide whether the claim is true, we have to answer a much simpler question. What exactly is the Book of Enoch? Who wrote it? When was it written? And why did one Christian tradition preserve it, while almost every other tradition left it behind? Every week on the 9th tablet, we investigate ancient claims by following the evidence back to the oldest surviving texts. No agendas. No sensationalism. Just history. Wherever it leads. If that's the kind of investigation you enjoy, subscribe before we begin. Because today's answer isn't hiding in a conspiracy. It's hiding in history. And history tells a story that's far more complicated than the internet usually admits. Because the Book of Enoch almost disappeared. And the reason it survived at all may be the first clue to understanding what it was really trying to say. If the Book of Enoch contained ideas so influential, why isn't it in most Bibles? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Maybe it was rejected. Maybe it was suppressed. Maybe it was considered too dangerous to survive. It's an explanation repeated so often online that many people accept it without question. But history tells a far more complicated story. Here's what we actually know. The Book of Enoch wasn't written by one person. And it wasn't written all at once. What we call one Enoch is actually a collection of several independent works, composed over hundreds of years, most likely between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century AD. Scholars generally divide it into 5 major sections. The Book of Watchers. The Book of Parables, also called the Similitudes. The Astronomical Book. The Dream Visions. And the Epistle of Enoch. Each reflects a different stage in the development of ancient Jewish thought. Yet together, they became one of the most influential religious works of the Second Temple period. Then, in 1947, everything changed. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls transformed the study of ancient Judaism. Among thousands of manuscript fragments recovered from the caves of Qumran, scholars found pieces of the Book of Enoch written in Aramaic. That discovery mattered enormously. Until then, many researchers had wondered whether Enoch was a much later Christian invention. The Dead Sea Scrolls answered that question. It wasn't. Large portions of the book were already circulating centuries before the birth of Jesus. J.T. Milik's publication of the Aramaic fragments became one of the foundations of modern Enoch scholarship. The book was ancient. Far older than many people had imagined. But then, the evidence took an unexpected turn. Among all those scrolls, one entire section of the Book of Enoch was nowhere to be found. Not damaged. Not incomplete. Missing. The section known as the Similitudes of Enoch. Perhaps the most discussed part of the entire collection. has never been identified among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not a single confirmed fragment. That absence has puzzled scholars for decades. Did that section exist later than the others? Was it preserved somewhere else? Or have its fragments simply never been discovered? Researchers such as James VanderKam and Lorenz Stuckenbrock have explored these possibilities extensively. But no definitive answer has emerged. And that's important. Because history sometimes leaves us with evidence. And sometimes with silence. Now the mystery becomes even stranger. Although Aramaic fragments survive, no complete ancient Hebrew or Aramaic copy of 1 Enoch has ever been found. The only complete version that has survived through history is written in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia. For centuries, Ethiopian scribes copied the book by hand. Generation after generation. Long after many other communities had stopped doing so. To this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church still includes 1 Enoch in its biblical canon. Most other Christian traditions do not. Not because they forgot the book existed, but because different communities gradually drew the boundaries of Scripture in different ways. The story is far less dramatic than internet myths suggest. And far more fascinating. So here's the real mystery. If early Jewish communities copied it, if the Dead Sea Scrolls preserved it, if early Christians knew it well enough to quote it, why did later traditions begin to treat it differently? Before you answer that, consider something else. If you were part of an early Christian community deciding which books belonged in Scripture, would you have included the Book of Enoch? Or would you have left it out? Keep your answer in mind. Because the next piece of evidence changes how many historians think about this entire debate. Before the Book of Enoch ever speaks about the fate of humanity, it tells the story of another rebellion. Not Adam. Not Noah. Angels. And according to the text, that rebellion changed the course of human history. The earliest section of 1 Enoch is known as the Book of Watchers. Most scholars consider it the oldest part of the collection, likely composed sometime during the 3rd century BCE, though it draws on traditions that may be even older. Its starting point is surprisingly familiar. A few mysterious verses in Genesis. Genesis says very little. Just a handful of verses describing the sons of God taking human wives. Then it moves on. The Book of Enoch doesn't. It builds an entire narrative around those few lines. According to Enoch, a group of heavenly beings called the Watchers descend to earth. Not by accident. By choice. They abandon the role assigned to them. Take human wives. Father a race of giants. And begin teaching humanity knowledge that was never meant to be revealed. The text lists those teachings in remarkable detail. Metalworking. Weapon making. Jewelry. Cosmetics. Astrology. Enchantments. Secret knowledge. To a modern reader, some of these don't seem evil at all. Others seem dangerous. But that's exactly what makes this story so fascinating. The problem isn't knowledge itself. It's knowledge received outside the order established by God. This distinction matters. The Book of Enoch never claims that learning is sinful. It claims certain knowledge crossed a boundary. A boundary the Watchers were never meant to cross. And humanity was never meant to receive. The consequences are immediate. Violence spreads. Corruption increases. Justice disappears. The earth itself is described as crying out because of what has happened. It's a dramatic explanation for why the world became so broken before the flood. One that expands far beyond the brief account found in Genesis. Fully shown. But here's something many online summaries miss. The heroes of this section aren't powerful kings. They aren't priests. They aren't warriors. They're described with a completely different word. The righteous. That word appears again. And again. And again. The righteous are the people who refuse to participate in corruption. Who remain faithful while the world around them falls apart. Who endure injustice without joining it. Already, the book is establishing a pattern. Not belief versus unbelief. But faithfulness versus corruption. Conduct. Integrity. Perseverance. Those themes will continue through almost every major section of the book. But then, the story introduces a figure who has fascinated scholars for generations. A mysterious individual called the Elect One. And the way this figure is described raises one of the biggest questions in all of Enoch scholarship. Before we continue, here's a question I'd like you to think about. If a book written before the time of Jesus describes a coming judge, who do you think its original readers believed that figure was? Don't answer too quickly. Because the next chapter is where history and interpretation begin to separate. If you've heard people talk about the Book of Enoch before, this is probably the section they were talking about. Not the Watchers. Not the Giants. But someone known simply as the Elect One. The figure appears throughout the section scholars call the Similitudes, or the Parables of Enoch. Unlike the Book of Watchers, this part doesn't begin with corruption. It begins with judgment. A final judgment. One that separates the righteous from the wicked. Again. And again. And again. The Elect One is described as sitting upon a throne of glory. Kings stand before him. The powerful are humbled. The oppressed are vindicated. Justice is finally established. It's one of the most dramatic visions in the entire collection. And it's also one of the most debated. Here's what we actually know. The text uses several titles for this mysterious figure. The Elect One. The Righteous One. The Son of Man. Those titles appear repeatedly throughout the Similitudes. That's the evidence. Now comes the interpretation. Because once early Christians began reading these passages, many saw familiar languages. The title, Son of Man. It appears frequently in the Gospels as one of Jesus' preferred ways of referring to himself. That similarity has sparked generations of discussion. Did the Book of Enoch influence New Testament language? Did both draw from earlier Jewish traditions? Or are the similarities more limited than they first appear? Scholars such as George Nickelsburg and John Collins have spent decades exploring those questions. But there is still no universal agreement. And that's an important reminder. Similarity doesn't automatically mean dependence. History is rarely that simple. But here's the detail that matters most for our investigation. Notice what the text keeps emphasizing. Not once does the Elect One ask, "What did you say you believed?" Instead, the repeated contrast is between two kinds of people. The righteous and the wicked. Those who remained faithful and those who embraced injustice. The focus is consistently ethical, not philosophical. This doesn't mean the Book of Enoch rejects faith. It means the book is asking a different question altogether. Modern readers often ask, how is someone saved? The Book of Enoch is asking, who remained faithful when the world became corrupt? Those aren't identical questions. And confusing them has created countless misunderstandings online. Retention bomb. Before we go any further, there's one fact almost no viral video mentions. The Similitudes, the very section we've been discussing, has never been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not one confirmed fragment. That doesn't prove the section is fake. Nor does it prove it was added later. It simply means historians have less evidence for this portion than for the Book of Watchers. That's why responsible scholars speak carefully. And that's why extraordinary claims about this section deserve extraordinary evidence. Which brings us back to the question we started with. If Enoch keeps describing the righteous, the faithful, just, is it actually redefining salvation? Or are we reading later theological debates into a text that was never trying to answer them in the first place? The answer lies in understanding the world that produced this book, not the world that inherited it. To understand what the Book of Enoch means by the righteous, we have to leave the manuscript behind for a moment and step into the world that produced it. Because books don't emerge in isolation. They are written by real communities, living through real crises. The centuries surrounding the composition of one Enoch were among the most turbulent in Jewish history. Empires rose and fell. Foreign rulers governed Jerusalem. Political factions competed for influence. And for many ordinary people, the world no longer seemed to make moral sense. Why did the powerful prosper, while the faithful suffered? Why did injustice appear to go unpunished? If God is just, why did the wicked seem to succeed? These weren't abstract theological puzzles. They were questions people asked while watching their own world unfold. This is where the Book of Enoch becomes remarkably consistent. Its answer is never. The wicked have already won. Instead, it insists that history is unfinished. Judgment is still coming. Justice has simply not arrived. Yet. Across its different sections, one idea appears repeatedly. The righteous endure. The wicked flourish. For a time. But that balance will not last forever. God's judgment will eventually reverse what history temporarily allows. This expectation lies at the heart of Jewish apocalyptic literature. Not escape from history, but the conviction that history itself will one day be set right. Scholar Michael Knibb has argued that writings like Enoch offered hope to communities living under pressure. Not by promising immediate rescue, but by assuring them that present injustice would not be permanent. James VanderKam similarly notes that Enoch repeatedly encourages perseverance rather than despair. The message is communal. Endure together. Remain faithful together. Wait together. Notice something else. The text never describes righteousness as perfection. Its heroes are not portrayed as flawless people who never struggle. Instead, they are people who refuse to abandon justice even when injustice appears stronger. That distinction matters. Because modern readers sometimes imagine righteousness as moral perfection. The Book of Enoch presents something more practical. Loyalty. Endurance. Faithfulness under pressure. Righteousness wasn't simply something you believed. It was something you continued to practice when it became costly. And now, the claim we began with starts to look different. Perhaps the Book of Enoch isn't replacing one path to salvation with another. Perhaps it's addressing a question that came before later debates about salvation were ever framed. Not, what must I believe? But, how do God's people remain faithful when justice seems absent? Those are very different questions. And confusing them may be the reason this book is so often misunderstood. But we're finally ready to test the viral claim itself. Not with assumptions. Not with theology. With the text. Does the Book of Enoch actually describe a hidden condition for salvation that the church later ignored? Or has the internet mistaken an ancient Jewish worldview for a completely different gospel? Before we continue, I'd like to hear your prediction. Based on the evidence you've seen so far, do you think the Book of Enoch truly contradicts later Christian teaching? Or do you think it's answering an entirely different question? Don't scroll to the comments yet. See whether your answer changes after the evidence in the next chapter. Flickering candlelight. The room is silent. We've reached the claim that brought us here. Not the version repeated online. The version we can actually test. Claim, the Book of Enoch teaches a completely different path to salvation than Christianity. It's a bold statement. But bold statements aren't judged by how often they're repeated. They're judged by whether the evidence supports them. So, after everything we've seen, what does the Book of Enoch actually say? Here's what the evidence supports. Throughout the collection, one pattern appears with remarkable consistency. The righteous are blessed. The wicked are judged. The faithful are vindicated. The corrupt face accountability. Those themes repeat from the Book of Watchers, through the dream visions, and into the Epistle of Enoch. That's not speculation. That's what the text repeatedly emphasizes. But here's where modern readers often make a subtle mistake. They assume the Book of Enoch is trying to answer the same question later Christian theology would ask. How is someone saved? The text never frames the issue that way. Instead, it asks something much older. When God judges the world, who will be found faithful? Those aren't the same conversation. This is where context matters. The Book of Enoch belongs to the world of Second Temple Judaism. A period when Jewish thinkers were wrestling with suffering, justice, the coming judgment, and the hope that God would finally set the world right. The systematic theological language many people are familiar with today hadn't yet developed. The categories are different. The concerns are different. Even the questions are different. From here, interpretation begins. Scholars such as George Nickelsburg, Michael Knibb, James VanderKam, and Annette Yoshiko Reed have all emphasized that Enoch reflects the diversity of Jewish thought during this period, not a hidden alternative religion waiting to be rediscovered. It represents one influential voice among many. Now consider something even more surprising. If early Christians believed the Book of Enoch was completely false, why does the New Testament quote it? The Epistle of Jude contains a passage that closely parallels 1 Enoch 1:9, even introducing it with the words, Enoch prophesied. That doesn't automatically settle debates about inspiration. Nor does it prove the entire book was accepted as scripture. But it does tell us something important. The Book of Enoch was known. It was respected. And at least one New Testament author considered part of it authoritative enough to quote. That isn't suppression. It's history. So, does the Book of Enoch describe a hidden condition for salvation? No. Not in the way countless videos claim. It never says, "Forget faith." It never says, "Ignore grace." And it never presents itself as correcting a future Christian doctrine that didn't yet exist. Those ideas belong to much later debates. Not to the world in which Enoch was written. What the Book of Enoch actually preserves is something both older and arguably more profound. A community convinced that history had become unjust, yet refusing to believe injustice would have the final word. Its message wasn't, "Believe this one hidden secret." Its message was, "Remain faithful, because God's judgment has not yet spoken its final sentence." That's a very different claim. And it's one the manuscript makes over and over and over again. Before we move to the conclusion, I want to ask you something. After hearing the actual evidence, do you think the internet exaggerated what the Book of Enoch says? Or do you think modern readers have simply been asking the wrong question all along? I'm genuinely interested to see where you land. Because the final chapter isn't about proving anyone wrong. It's about understanding why this book continues to fascinate millions of people. More than 2,000 years after it was written. We began this investigation with a claim that the Book of Enoch teaches a completely different path to salvation than Christianity. It's an idea repeated in thousands of videos, shared across countless websites, and often presented with complete certainty. But after following the evidence, the picture that emerges is something very different. No surviving manuscript of 1 Enoch ever says, "Here is the one hidden condition for salvation." It never presents itself as correcting Christianity. It never claims later believers misunderstood God. Because it wasn't written to answer those questions. Those debates belonged to centuries that hadn't happened yet. Instead, the Book of Enoch belongs to a different world. A world where faithful people watched injustice flourish. Where foreign empires ruled their land. Where the wicked often appeared to prosper. And where the greatest question wasn't, "What denomination is correct?" It was, "Will God ever make things right?" That question echoes through every section of the book. And perhaps that's why it has never truly disappeared. History is full of books that vanished because nobody cared enough to preserve them. The Book of Enoch wasn't one of them. Jewish communities copied it. The Qumran community treasured it. Early Christians knew it well enough to quote it. Ethiopian Christians preserved it for nearly 2,000 years. Every generation saw something worth saving. Even when they disagreed about its place in Scripture. That alone tells us something remarkable. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this investigation has nothing to do with proving the internet wrong. It's about learning how ancient texts should be read. Not through modern arguments, but through the world that produced them. Because once we force ancient books to answer modern questions, we often stop hearing what they were actually trying to say. History becomes clearer when we stop asking it to sound like us. So, does the Book of Enoch describe a hidden path to salvation? No. The evidence doesn't support that claim. But it does preserve something just as valuable. A window into Jewish thought before Christianity emerged. A community wrestling with justice, judgment, hope, and faithfulness in a broken world. Without books like Enoch, we would understand far less about the world that shaped the New Testament itself. Sometimes, the greatest value of an ancient text isn't that it answers every question. It's that it shows us what people were asking long before we arrived. Which brings us back to where we started. The internet promised us a hidden secret. The manuscript offered something far rarer. Context. And in history, context is often more powerful than the myth that replaced it. If you've stayed with me to the end, thank you. It tells me you're interested in something that's becoming increasingly rare. Following the evidence wherever it leads. If you enjoyed this investigation, consider subscribing to the 9th tablet. Every week we return to the oldest surviving texts, not to prove a theory, but to discover what they actually say. And I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective. If you had been part of the early church, would you have included the Book of Enoch in the biblical canon, or would you have left it out? There's no simple yes or no answer. Tell me why. I'll be reading the discussion, and some of the best insights may shape future investigations. The oldest texts rarely survive because they answered every question. They survive because, thousands of years later, we're still trying to answer the questions they asked first. Until next time, keep searching the oldest pages, because history still has stories it hasn't finished telling.